The night Tessalia, Tess, as her mother called her, met the sea witch, had been the worst night of her life. If asked, she could perfectly recall the kiss of the frigid and salty air on her young face as she stood outside the house she shared with her mother, gazing down the hills to where the ocean lapped at the shore. It was something she had taken to every day in those times, watching as the massive ships rose over the horizon far into the distance. At the time, she was no more than 15, the perfect age to have an adult understanding of the gravity of the events as they happened, but still young enough that she had not quite yet shed the childhood feeling of permanence. In a better life, she would not have needed to know the cares that she did after that night, as ready as she had thought herself for them at the time. She remembered how terrible the visibility had been that day as a storm roared in the distance, constantly closing ever closer while she went about her day. The worry that her father would return and that she wouldn't see him wore heavily as she had wandered down to the market, on instructions from her mother to snatch up as many fruits as she could from the recent imports from Narathashis. Tess remembered selecting almost a dozen apples, each so thoroughly infused with manna that she could almost taste the savory and crisp sweetness of the things already as she held them in her hand. She remembered, too, the hope that had bloomed in her chest when she looked away from the merchant for a moment, catching a glimpse of a ship sailing steadily into the harbor, bearing the green colors of the Admiralty. Her task momentarily forgotten, she had paid for the fruits and hurried down to the docks. It had stung her when, on closer inspection, the figurehead was unfamiliar, and the ornate golden lettering on the forward portside bow did not read The Dauntless. Her limbs had felt heavier when she returned to the market, selected more fruits, then trudged back up the town to her home. Tess had done her best to hide her disappointment from her mother when she returned, and they shared one of the apples. She remembered her eyes wandering constantly to the seaside window, hoping desperately that the dauntless green sails would appear just over the horizon. Perhaps the only thing she couldn't tell you is the conversation she had distractedly made with her mother as the older woman tended to the coals of a growing fire, feeding legumes into the kettle suspended over it for their supper. The most important thing on her mind at the time, she recalled, was the need to suppress the urge to ask her mother whether or not she thought her father would return that day. It had been a constant topic of conversation in the preceding weeks, but, at the age she was, she had grown aware enough to recognize when her mother did not share her enthusiasm. Her mother had never said anything in specific, but her attitude was dismissive, and she would often start assigning Tess to new chores when the conversation went on too long. A couple weeks before, after such a conversation, her mother had sent Tess to pull grass from the path to their house from the main road. On a December night such as that, there were no more than 2 new stalks of grass that she found growing where it was not welcome, and she suspected that those 2 had simply been missed over the previous months that the foliage along the path was managed. However, when returning to the house, she had been reaching for the doorknob, quite intent to re-enter the warm house, shed her heavy cloak and boots, when a sound had made her stop. She heard distinctly as more followed, and she suddenly peered through the glass port next to the window, glimpsing her mother slumped over the table, her face buried in her hands. After that, she had made sure to remind her mother as little as possible of her grief, difficult as that was for her father's daughter. She had always been more like her father than her mother was comfortable with. Tess knew that from a young age by the way that she had driven her mother practically mad with her tendency to wander off, gallivanting about the beach in search of sea giants and krakens. The way Tess saw it, she could hardly be blamed for following after the stories that her father had told her. Though her mother disliked her tendency to prattle on about her hopes of slaying such terrifying sea creatures, she had actively forbidden her only a little. The most she did was make Tess promise to return before nightfall, and, even then, when she would sheepishly traipse into the house an hour after the sun had disappeared over the western horizon, she found her mother was still reluctant to punish her with anything more than a scolding and a few extra chores the next day. It was only years later that she would realize why her mother was so permissive, and it was the only thing that other people knew better about herself than she did. Her face. She was the spitting image of her father in more ways than she had properly understood. She had his brown doe eyes, his charcoal hair which caressed downward in large ringlets, and his strong but kindly jaw. Though she certainly took her fair share of features from her mother, something about the way her face was never far from that signature winning smile, reminded everyone in her life to an almost irritating degree of her father, and made her mother soft for her in a way that she wasn't for anyone else. Though there was certainly a bridge too far for the both of them, one of which she would learn that very night. That her mother loved her and her father deeply was something that she could never deny, despite how it would seem sometimes when her mind was most addled with rage. For her childhood self, the bridge too far had been the day that she had proudly proclaimed her intentions that day of finding and romancing a mermaid in terms much more crude than she had properly understood at the time. When she returned that day, her hunt unsuccessful, as always, she stopped at the door, only to overhear the last of a hushed argument which marked the last time that Tess was allowed to accompany her father to the celebrations with his sailors which marked the days before departures. That was around 2 years before that fateful night that he had returned home that one last time.